hurricane season. What is it that people should be doing right now?
Well, they should be preparing for the season, getting their supplies ready, preparing around their homes themselves, just getting ready for the possibility of a landfall in our area. We never know when and where those landfalls will be, but it just pays to be prepared, and that's the main thing we like to stress, because it only takes one big storm to affect you and your property and your family.
So how should people react then to Colorado State coming out and saying, oh, it's a below average year, or hey, it's an El Nino, I ain't got nothing to worry about?
Yeah, well, you don't need to focus on that, because when they, indications are that we may be coming up on a slightly below average year. But again, a below average year does not mean we won't have any hurricanes. It doesn't mean we won't have any major hurricanes, and it also doesn't mean there won't be a landfall in your area. So you got to be prepared for that eventuality if indeed there is a landfall in your area, because, as we said, it only takes one storm, and you need to be prepared for that one storm.
And our sister station did some research. They found that during El Nino years anyway, that there was actually more of a tendency to have a landfalling tropical system along the Louisiana or Mississippi coastline. So maybe people should be even more prepared this year than any other year? Yeah,
well, you should be equally prepared every year, I think. But what happens in an El Nino year, while there may be a lower number of storms, oftentimes that's more for the Atlantic Ocean out to the east of us. We still get development in the Gulf, and I think just the likelihood of those areas being impacted by a storm, remains equally the same, or maybe a little more, just because once something forms in the Gulf, it's going to be in the Gulf and, likely impact the northern Gulf region.
What's the average return period on a tropical system, or let's say a Category 1 hurricane for Mississippi and Alabama?
A Category 1 for the Alabama, Mississippi coastal areas is about every 10, 11 years. A Category major hurricane 3 or above is about 20-year average, or maybe even a little more. And so that's the basic return period. Now, you can have several storms within a few year period, or you may go quite a while in there, but generally every 10 years for a hurricane or so, and every 20 years or so for a major hurricane.
Last year, speaking of major hurricanes, we had Matthew take a hard right-hand turn. We had Hermine take a hard right-hand turn.
Yep.
And I think it was even Colin kind of was moving this direction, then decided, I want to take off and go to the right.
Yeah.
What gives?
Well, it's basically just the atmospheric processes around the storm. Several of those you mentioned were weaker storms, and what happens when they're weaker, they may not be moving much, and the influences in the atmosphere that really drive these things is usually up a little higher aloft in the atmosphere, so they may not be moving a whole lot, and as they strengthen, they deepen in the atmosphere, and as they get deeper, it's almost like a solid object, when you throw it into a river or something like that, it just kind of goes with the flow. As they get deeper, they move with that flow, and oftentimes in those examples, we had a trough coming in that tends to lift things to the north and east on the east side of the trough, so they just got caught up in the trough.
So what would you say to the folks that say, oh, we've got a magical protective bubble over the area that stops all hurricanes from coming this direction? I
would say that that's not true, and you need to be prepared. Just because it's been a while since we've had some activity, it only takes that one storm, and you never know. Even on some quieter years in the past, we've had 2 or 3 systems impact our area. So it's just, those outlooks, whether they're above average or below average, don't really indicate where landfalls will occur. And, some stretches of the coast in our area have been lucky over the last decade or two, but it's not a question of, if that will run out, but when that runs out.
So in the thing that we're putting together, going back to your deepening of the convection, we're going to be talking about the modeling in there, and I've always said that the BAM model is decent on guidance for kind of where it's going to go.
Right.
But the difference between the three, the S, the M, and the D, oftentimes is predicated on how deep the convection is actually. Could you kind of elaborate on that for folks at home as somebody who uses these models on a very regular basis?
Okay, yeah, the ones that, you know, they like, as you say, they depend, each model is different on the depth of the atmosphere that the storms are in. So you're going to get different solutions with those models. Now as the storm strengthens and gets deeper, the models that are designed for the deeper convection would be the more dependable models to focus on, you know, when you've got a more detailed, more enhanced storm in the area.
So you mentioned, you know, it's been a while since we've had to deal with any kind of a catastrophic storm. Katrina was probably the one that everybody kind of leans on around here. You know, we do Stone, George, Greene, and Perry counties, which lost a lot of woods. You know, a lot of timber is gone from that. A lot of people look back at Katrina and say, "Oh, that's the storm of the century. That's
the benchmark storm.
That's the benchmark. That's as bad as it gets." But that's maybe not necessarily the case.
No, Katrina, at one point over the Gulf, it was a category almost a 5 storm, but it was really weakening fairly significantly as it moved ashore on the northern Gulf Coast here, and it was, you know, a high-end 2, low-end 3 at landfall. So as bad as Katrina was, especially in those inland communities there with the wind damage, you know, it was in the kind of in the middle to lower end of the scale of what potentially could happen in a hurricane. So, you know, you need to be prepared for that higher end, and it can certainly be worse than what Katrina was for the area.
And as we look out into the Atlantic, right now you've got that cluster of storms on the tail end of that front hanging out around Haiti and the Dominican Republic. As something that's probably not going to be used in this program, but rather something that just for the edification of people currently, that's not something to worry about yet, right?
No, not so much yet, especially for our area. You know, the earlier season storms do tend to be where they evolve from a frontal type system or something like that that goes through, stalls out over the Gulf or the Caribbean or the Southeast Atlantic and slowly evolve into a tropical system. But for this particular case, it's not anything to really be concerned about at this time.
Hypothetical world, it turns into something and becomes an invest. For folks at home, what's an invest?
Well, an invest is mainly just an investigative area of disturbed weather that, you know, the Hurricane Center and us here in the local weather service offices, we monitor all the disturbances in the tropics. And there are some that are in the atmospheric conditions where they're more conducive for development, and the models may be the larger scale global models may be indicating some development. So what we do is we'll start essentially an investigation of that system and monitor the potential for development with that. And once it's declared an invest, you begin running the model data, the tropical model data that gives us track and intensity estimates. The thing is, you have to be careful with the invest is they're based on something that's not there yet. You know, the potential is there, but the system is so disorganized, the forecasts that you get from that, from the model data, you know, are not terribly accurate just because there's nothing for them to initialize on. So that's what you got to be careful when you start hearing about invest and seeing the forecast tracks for an invest. And no need to really get worried if you see a track in your area, particularly on an invest, just because things could change quite a bit. But it's basically just a disturbed area that, you know, is worthy of an enhanced look.
And sticking with the old invest, 99L from last year, the eventual Hurricane.
The one that lasted forever.
What gives? Why was that invest for so long?
Yeah, well, what happened with that one is very early on in the process, when it was far out in the Atlantic, it started showing some, you know, signs that it could develop. But as it moved west across the Atlantic, they started an invest on it early. But as it moved west, it was in a high shear environment, dry air. There was a lot of what we call a Saharan dust. There was a lot of African dust kind of in the area, and all that combines to limit development. And so it moved for, I think it was close to like 10 days from the western or eastern Atlantic all the way into the Caribbean Sea and eventually up toward the Gulf. It just took it. It had the potential that whole time, but there were just some factors working against it. But it took that full 10 days for it to get into an environment where it could develop, and eventually it did.
And so as a storm develops from an invest to a tropical depression, to a tropical storm, to eventually a hurricane, a major hurricane,
Right.
As people are following along, if they're in the cone or whatever, how often should they check back with the forecast? How often does stuff change, really, with a storm like that?
Well, I mean, it could change every advisory. So every 6 hours, every new advisory that is issued, you really need to pay attention to it and note the changes. That's really what you want to note, the changes of, the probabilities of what wind speeds you'll be seeing, your storm surge heights if you're along the coast. All that can change, and at times change significantly every 6 hours. So as frequently as possible, and ideally every update from the Hurricane Center in your local office, Weather Service office, ideally you want to be checking every update.
So it seems like, to the average person, that this is a lot of work as a person, right? If I got to follow, I got to pay attention to all these updates, I got to know all this stuff about the tropics, but why should I care so much as a regular person about all this stuff?
Well, you need to care because it could impact you. That's what we're here for, is to give you all the information you need to be prepared for a major storm and the timing of some of the impacts from that storm, and just help you protect your property and your family. And obviously, the more you check in this day and age, everybody's got their phone in their hand, social media is rampant out there, so it's not really, you're not really going out of your way to get the information, because we issue the stuff, generously. It's issued just right and left. And as you can get that information, you're just helping yourself out, essentially. You're preparing yourself and your family and your home.
Perfect. Thanks, sir.